Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Huff and I'm very happy to be with you today. I am just a few months away from getting my PhD in American Studies at Purdue University. My dissertation is titled Virgin Land: Young Women and Sexual Citizenship in the Contemporary United States. I research the rhetoric of virginity in the contemporary United States, which I define as being from 1945 through 2008. So, purity literature is a big part of what I do and a big part of why I chose this topic for my research. So, today I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. How I started researching purity and virginity and how I do those things. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about feminist criticisms of contemporary purity culture and what I think is wrong with those criticisms, as well as some of those criticisms that have merit. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the historical precedent for purity culture in the United States and where that comes from. And finally, I'd like to end today by talking about some different ways that we could imagine purity culture looking in the future. So, first things first, even though this may seem a little redundant for most of you, just a quick definition of what purity is and what virginity is. So, virginity, of course, is the state of not having had sex. And we're going to leave aside for today the very complicated matters of how exactly different people and different cultures define sex. Um, and we're just going to say that virginity is not having had sex. So, virginity and purity are related, as oftentimes being a virgin is part of being pure. I like to say that virginity is necessary but not sufficient for purity. So, virginity is primarily a negative identity. That means it's defined by what a person has not done. And purity is a positive identity. So it's defined by things that you actively do, choices that you make as an individual. And those choices can be how to dress, or what media to consume, or they can be about putting boundaries around a partnered relationship. But it is active. It doesn't just rely on not doing something, which is what virginity does. It relies on making active choices every day. So if you're familiar with purity literature, if you've read any of the many uh, manuals for young men and young women, or for marriage manuals that come out of different evangelical presses, then you'll know that many of them have very specific definitions of purity, but they all kind of boil down to three things, which is that purity has a mental, spiritual, and physical component. So virginity is part of that physical component, but again, there's the mental and the spiritual components of purity. And so different authors talk about those in different ways, but I think the core of the matter is that it really does come down to being a positive, active identity. So when it comes to mental purity, what are the types of things that you're putting in your mind? Are you consuming media that will help you stay pure or that will be a challenge to your purity? When it comes to spiritual purity, it is a lot about am I seeking to live in accordance to what I believe is God's will for my life? And then, of course, there's the physical definition, which is where virginity comes in. So, purity culture has been around in the United States for quite some time. Um, and we will talk a little bit more about the historical aspect a little bit later today. What I'd like to focus on now is purity culture started gaining a lot of mainstream news coverage starting in about 2001. And the reason that this happened is because there were changes made by the federal government under President Bush in how sex education was funded in public schools. And so what happened is abstinence only education received a lot more funding and became very prominent in public schools. And a lot of the abstinence only education curriculum materials were coming out of Christian publishers and evangelical publishers who were kind of immersed in this purity culture. So that's when purity culture really kind of left being a specialized group for self identified Christians and moved into schools for folks who uh, were not necessarily Christian or had a range of different beliefs. And so when it moved into schools, that's when it started, public schools, that's when it started getting a lot of mainstream attention, particularly from feminist media sources. And so it received a lot of criticism. And as someone who went to Christian schools from third grade through college, I was very interested in the criticisms I was hearing about purity concepts in feminist news media. And so one of the things that drove me to do my work is as someone who had lived with purity culture for quite some time, as well as someone who identified as a feminist and a scholar. I thought that there were some crucial mistakes being made in feminist criticisms of purity culture. And so the biggest mistake that I saw was that many feminist authors writing about purity culture, such as Jessica Valenti and Amy Bumgardner, the way that they wrote about purity culture was as if it was a mystery or a scam that was being perpetrated on people against their will. And so I knew from my experiences in purity culture, and I would guess that some of you know as well, that this isn't true. So, purity culture, like almost anything else that people engage in, it serves a purpose. You know, people don't just engage in it because they have to. A lot of people, including myself, engaged in purity culture because they received something valuable from it that they weren't finding in other places, right? So, purity culture can be a very empowering choice for a lot of people. And so, what I found in feminist criticisms of purity culture was this idea that it didn't serve a function. And I thought that that was just wrong. It was wrong from my personal experience, the experiences of friends. And I thought that feminist critics who did not have much experience with Christian and evangelical culture in the United States really were not taking into account how this fit into people's broader lifestyle choices as Christians. So I wanted to do a work that honored the fact that purity culture does have a function, that it serves a purpose in people's lives, that people get something valuable from it. And to do that, I started looking at purity balls, which have been a long time bugaboo of feminist critiques of purity culture. And so, if you've read any of the critiques of purity balls, again by Jessica Valenti or Amy Bumgardner, they've both written several. What you'll see is that they talk about purity balls as a girl promising her virginity to her father until her father can give it to her husband. So, if you've participated in a purity ball or if you've researched them at all, you know that this is not the case. So, one of the interesting things about purity balls is that they are often more about the father than the daughter. So, at most purity balls, young women don't really promise anything. Their fathers instead promise to be pure male examples for their daughters, right? So, it's more about a father making a commitment to a daughter and his family than it is about a young woman promising virginity. And so a lot of feminist criticisms of period balls were about, girls as young as 6 who don't really have any knowledge of what virginity even means as a concept, or what it will mean to be a virgin until marriage, promising to remain virginal. And it's not about that. It's mostly about fathers declaring to their daughters that they're going to be a good role model, the best role model they can, so that their daughters know what a good Christian man looks like. That's not to say that I don't think there are some critiques that can be made of purity balls. I certainly think there are some valid critiques, but I don't want to get into those too far today. Um, and it's an area that I would encourage you to either look up on your own, or to discuss with people that you may know who have participated in those purity balls, or discuss with people who you know who may be critical of purity balls as well. Um, so, in my work and trying to counter these criticisms that I felt weren't really taking into account what people got from purity culture, what made it appealing, I did come across some legitimate criticisms. And so these are kind of my take. In my dissertation, I do a content review of 4 prominent abstinence only education curricula, and I compare that with evangelical guides on dating, sex, and marriage. And so there are a couple of common themes that come up that I think are problematic. And those are that women are talked about as basically asexual creatures until marriage, as if women don't really have sex drives until they've been properly romanced. And the other side of that coin is men are talked about as if they have kind of unstoppable sex drives. And what this does is it creates a dynamic where women have to be responsible not only for their own sex drive, but for their male partner's sex drive as well. They have to be what's called the gatekeeper, the person who stops things before they go too far. And to be honest, as a feminist, I think this is a really problematic way to talk about men. To say that their sex drives are unstoppable, that they are animalistic, that they need someone to impose authority from outside, and that someone has to be a woman who doesn't have the same sex drive. So, I just think that that's kind of insulting when I think about the men in my life. They are um, they're good people, and they're perfectly capable of moving through the day without being totally derailed by an unstoppable sex drive, right? They have brains that they use regularly. And at the same time, women also have sex drives. And to tell women that they don't have sex drive until they're properly romanced, I think creates a lot of confusion, or creates the potential for confusion about women understanding their own sex drives. So, if the goal of purity culture is for men and women to get married and have happy marriages, then telling men that their sex drives are unstoppable and telling women that they really don't have a sex drive until a certain number of criteria have been met, I think creates a lot of confusion on how these two people are supposed to come together and live together. So, those are what I think of as some legitimate criticisms, and those have a historical basis for how those emerged. So, I want to talk a little bit about that historical basis. So, purity culture uh, it hasn't just been a part of the United States for quite some time. Purity culture, in one form or another, has been related to the church for most of its history, but not in the ways that we know it now. So, the purity culture that's in the United States today is it's a very recent historical invention. It really doesn't stretch back past the 20th century. Um, Before that, purity culture and the way that the church thought about purity and virginity were very, very different. So, specifically, the promise of most purity culture outlets today, whether they be books or speakers or whatnot, is that if you live purely until you get married, then you will have a better marriage, you will have a better sex life in your marriage, than you would have if you did not live purely. And so that's a connection between living purely and staying a virgin as part of that purity until marriage that really was not there until maybe the 20th century. And I would actually argue that wasn't a big part of purity rhetoric until the mid 20th century. Um, in the ancient church, it was very, very different in terms of marriage was kind of considered a necessity for most people who could not control their sex drives, right? Better to marry than to burn. But the ideal was to remain virginal and to remain unpartnered so that you could commit all of your energy and time and resources to serving God and the church, right? So the idea that you remain pure to have a better marriage, um, it wouldn't have made sense to Christians um, a couple of hundred years ago. That would have been, well, more than a couple hundred years ago, I guess. But it wouldn't have made sense in the early church that you would stay a virgin to have a better marriage. Because the whole point of remaining virginal was to give yourself to God. The point of remaining pure and unmarried and unattached was to serve God with everything that you had and not have kind of the earthly distraction of a intimate partner and of sexuality. So this is where we see kind of as the church goes along, monastic communities and groups of people committing themselves to God and living in a communal way, but also rejecting sex and sexuality and taking vows of purity and chastity to commit themselves to God. So that's just one way in which today's purity culture is a little weird or would be kind of unrecognizable to previous generations of Christians. Another thing that's really interesting is I look at purity rhetoric. My master's is in rhetoric. I'm very interested in communication. It's a big part of how I study purity culture. And so there's a wonderful book by an author, Jennifer Wright Nust. It's called Abandoned to Lust. And what she does in that book is she really shows how um, in the early church there were a lot of divisions around what it really meant to be a Christian or how best to live as a Christian and what Christianity meant, right? So figuring out kind of all of these um, nuts and bolts issues around what does it really mean to live as a Christian, to be a Christian. Um, and so uh, Nust shows how uh, both groups opposed to the early church and the early church itself adopted a rhetorical tradition from ancient Greece and Rome, which was to accuse people that you disagreed with as having loose sexual morals. And so, what this is rooted in is a very classical type of patriarchy where the patriarch, the father, the head of household, his character is judged on how the people that he has responsibility for act. And so in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that would have been not only his wife and his children, but that would have been his servants, etc. And if those people uh, do not live up to a high moral standard, then that casts suspicion on the character of the patriarch. And so um, the accusations of sexual impurity or immorality were a very ancient way of delegitimizing someone that you disagreed with. And again, Nust shows how not only different communities who were opposed to early Christians use this against Christians, but different Christian factions actually use this against each other. And so I think that that's important to understand how the rhetoric of purity in the church is not politically neutral. It has historically been politically mobilized for the gain of one group over another, right? And I think it's also important to understand that the rhetoric of purity is always in some way connected to the rhetoric of patriarchy as well. So I don't think that the church has to be patriarchal. I think often the church has been a great force for liberating oppressed groups, including women, and fighting back against systems that hurt people like patriarchy. Uh, but purity culture itself does have very deep ties and very deep roots to this kind of politicized patriarchal discourse. So, knowing that, right? Knowing that purity culture is related to political gain often and is related to patriarchal norms, how do we want to continue to conceive of patriarchal culture? As I said earlier, I think it's quite frankly unfair and a little insulting to men to say, as most purity culture sources do presently, that they are ruled by their sex drives, that they can't fight against it. It's almost as if to say that they don't have brains or have control when it comes to their sex drive. They do, I think. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to go out in public every day, right? So, um, what are ways that we can use or adopt the good parts of purity culture, the parts that nourish people and do something for them, the parts that are empowering, and maybe remove those parts that are less than helpful? And so, part of what I argue for in my dissertation is a sex positive interpretation of purity culture. So, sex positive doesn't mean I'm positive that everyone should be having sex. Excuse me. Sex positive just means that I want people to be fully informed and equipped to make the best choice for them. So, I think when it comes to sex positive purity culture, there's a really good book um, by Diana E. Anderson called Damaged Goods. Anderson has a bachelor's degree in theology and a master's degree in English. She was also raised in purity culture. And so in Damaged Goods, she proposes um, a theologically based, sex positive ethics of sexuality. So I would definitely check that out if you have the time. But what I'm going to do in our last couple minutes together today is give you my idea of what sex positive purity could be. So there's a wonderful documentary by filmmaker Therese Schechter called How to Lose Your Virginity. And in that documentary, Schechter looks primarily at the United States, but she incorporates a lot of history around different discourses of virginity. And she interviews a lot of people who have been involved in purity culture. And one interview that occurs fairly early in the film is a woman who she and her husband were both virgins when they married. They were very involved in purity culture and had lived their whole lives in purity culture in the church. And we're very excited to be married and to have a robust sex life, which is part of the promise of contemporary purity cultures that if you wait, your sex life as a married person will be better. So on their wedding night, they did attempt to have intercourse, and what they found is that the woman had vaginismus. So, vaginismus is just a technical medical term for when the muscles of the vagina are too tight and it becomes incredibly painful to insert something into the vagina. So, It's a fairly common medical condition. It's very easily treatable. Um, and at the same time, if you don't know that you have it or you don't know how to treat it, it's very, very painful. And so this woman tells her story of the fact that, you know, she had this disastrous wedding night because neither she nor her husband knew what was happening to her body, and they didn't know enough about their bodies to even begin to ask the right questions for how to fix this. So that I think is the biggest flaw of contemporary purity culture, is that it often discourages conversations around sexuality. And so I think a sex positive purity culture would be to encourage people to embrace purity if it's the right choice for them, but to enable them to make that decision about whether or not it's the right choice for them by providing them with, how do I want to say, all the information they could possibly need to make an informed decision, right? So, I think purity culture in the United States could only be aided by talking about the proper use of a condom, different types of contraceptive, if that's something that you're interested in, common problems such as vaginismus or urinary tract infections or even yeast infections, all of which are very common. And, if you don't know how those can or will affect your sex life, can become very big problems when they don't have to be, right? And so that's what I think of. That's my vision for a positive purity culture, is a purity culture that talks about all the benefits of purity and why people might choose that, and also coupling that with a robust conversation around the many types of sexuality that exist in the world, so that people, when they choose purity culture, are choosing it not because they don't feel they have other options or because it's what everyone else around them is doing, but because they know for sure that the benefits of purity culture are something that they want in their life. So, thank you so much for listening to me today. I hope that this has been clear and easy to follow. I know that sometimes when I get started talking about virginity and purity culture, I tend to ramble. I would be happy if anyone has any questions. Please feel free to email me at houghj@purdue.edu. I also have a blog where I post excerpts from my dissertation research from time to time. So if you're interested in looking up a more specific issue, or going in depth on some of the issues that we've talked about today, you can find some of that on my blog. It's Huffluck, which is like tough luck, but with an H at the beginning. It's huffluck.wordpress.com. And some of the resources I mentioned today that I would encourage you to check out if you have time are the documentary How to Lose Your Virginity by Therese Schechter, Damaged Goods, a book by Diana E. Anderson. She also has a great blog, by the way, if you Google search her, and Abandoned to Lust by Jennifer Wright Nust. And just because I always think it's interesting and valuable to follow up with the opposing side, so to speak, Jessica Valenti's book, The Purity Myth, um, is a great resource to see kind of feminist criticisms of contemporary purity culture. Her book was also made into a documentary, so you could also look up the documentary, The Purity Myth. And then there are some really great documentaries about virginity and purity culture that I would strongly encourage you to check out if you have the time. The Virgin Daughters is a documentary that was actually made by BBC in the UK about purity balls here in the United States. That whole documentary is available on YouTube. It's about 45 minutes long. And there's another documentary called Virgin Tales, which follows the Wilson family in Colorado. So they are the founders of the largest purity ball in the United States. So Virgin Tales follows the Wilsons for about 2 years, and it's kind of a fascinating look inside a family that is very devoted to purity culture. Um, and one of the things I like about Virgin Tales is it's not judgmental. It doesn't really take a stand on purity culture. It just follows this family, and that is intermittently available on YouTube. The last time I checked, it was up and able to be watched in its entirety, but sometimes it gets taken down. So, those are some further resources for following up on things. And again, if you have any particular questions for me, please do feel free to email me. And thank you for listening to me today. It was such a pleasure to join you.